Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about 3 mistakes that new writers make when writing their first chapter that you must avoid, and 3 ways to help you with this. Dave was supposed to be here to help me explain this to you, but he's not here. So I'm going to give you the first thing and we will go see if we can find him. So the first thing to avoid is do not introduce too many characters, names, places in the first chapter. And the reason for this is because people connect with people. People read books to connect with people. And if there's too much going on, too many names, too many characters, then the reader might get confused and stop reading your book. And it also, the reader doesn't know who to connect with, who to root for in this story. So it's super important that you don't introduce too much in the first chapter. Now, it's okay if you have lots of characters in your story, because a lot of stories do, but don't introduce them all in the first chapter. So number 2 is avoid giving too much backstory in the first chapter. We all know that the story has happened before the first chapter starts. That's what gives a really good story. But we don't want to give too much backstory in the first chapter. And I see that he made popcorn. Interesting. So when you're thinking about backstory, you want to sprinkle it in. Now you see, we want to sprinkle in a little bit. Now, if I took this salt and I dumped the whole thing in that popcorn would be ruined. And it's the same thing with our story. Sprinkle in lightly the backstory in the first chapter, just enough to get your reader interested and to pique their curiosity. Number 3 is avoid having too much world building description or information in your first chapter. Now, I love world building because you can be so creative, especially if you're writing like a sci-fi or a fantasy book or something super creative. That's super fun, but you don't want to dump all that information on your reader, because your reader, again, wants to connect with your character. And if you have just pages of description, that's just not what the reader's wanting. So you want to sprinkle in the world building just like you do with backstory. Nothing puts a reader to sleep like pages and pages of description of the world that this story takes place in. It's boring.
Hey!
These are ways that you can avoid these mistakes. And number 1 is introduce your protagonist on the first page at an exciting point of either internal or external conflict. It doesn't have to be the main conflict of the story, but it needs to show us who the character is and what are some of the things that your character is going to face in the story. Now, the focus needs to be on the protagonist, because that's who your reader is going to connect with. And you can give a little bit, a sprinkle of world building and backstory in there, but focus on your main character, because this is where your hook is super important. And your hook, the main character, the protagonist, is the key to your hook. So focus on your main character. And number 2 ways to avoid these mistakes is to give your reader a reason to care about what happens to your protagonist. Now, one of the ways you can do this is to expose and show like an internal conflict. And an easy way to do this is think about something that your character is afraid of, something that you want them to face throughout the story, and you can present that in the first chapter. An example of this, one of my favorite examples, is Indiana Jones. Who doesn't love Indiana Jones? Well, in the Indiana Jones movie, in the first part of it, it shows how he has a fear of snakes. And then later on in the movie, he ends up in a pit of snakes and he has to face that. Now, the power of this is that Indiana Jones is this really brave adventurer and he does these great things, but he has a very common fear and it makes him relatable to the viewer in the case of a movie and to the reader in the case of a book. One of the ways you can reveal the internal conflict of your character is to really know your character before you start writing. You can do that with the 10-minute character sketch that we've developed. The link will be in the description so you can grab that and fill that out before you start writing. Now, when you do this, this will give you a lot of the internal conflict and the character's motivation for why they do what they do. And number 3 is give the reader enough information about the world to pique their curiosity and keep them reading. You want the reader to be curious about what they don't know yet. In the Electrical Saga, Book 1, we meet Aurora and Blaze, and we're introduced to them, and there's an initial conflict, and there's a little bit of what kind of world do they live in, but it leaves you wondering, what is really happening at Station 29? And that's what you want from your first chapter, to keep the reader curious.